MultiGreen, building attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily real estate through impact investing.
Welcome to the MultiGreen podcast. I'm your host, Randy Norton, and today we'll be speaking with Andy Winkler, the Bipartisan Policy Center's Director for Housing and Infrastructure Projects. Captured on location in Washington, D.C., we discussed the Bipartisan Policy Center's exploration of bipartisan financial and supply-side housing solutions and how policymakers can learn from the experience of MultiGreen and many other stakeholders. Enjoy our conversation. Andy, it's so great to be in Washington, D.C. today, this seasonal atmosphere right in front of the White House. You get this every day.
Every day. Walk past it every day. Well, I did pre-pandemic.
And why is that? What are you doing here in Washington, D.C.?
Trying to make a difference like everybody else, right? Trying to do some good.
Tell us about your title and role.
So I work currently as the Director of the Housing and Infrastructure Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. It's a mouthful, but we like to bill ourselves as the only think tank in town actively devoted to bipartisanship. So I have a lot of different roles and responsibilities, but BPC is kind of unique among think tanks in that all of our projects, try to build consensus. We have task forces and commissions, and I run a couple of them specifically devoted to housing policy and to infrastructure, which are, intricately linked.
Some would say housing is a part of the infrastructure, or it should be, or it could be, at least when talking about asset management and portfolio allocation. How would you link the two? It's in your title.
It's in my title, and I have found there are many, many, many similarities in how you finance, build, develop both sorts of systems. They're different systems, they have different constituencies, but I think housers, in particular, would like to see housing as infrastructure, and it really should be, because it is it is a part of our communities, and it needs to be connected to all these other systems. And if we think in a silo, we aren't doing ourselves a service. We're spending money poorly. We aren't planning correctly, and it leads to bad outcomes. So I kind of like that my job is both, because they should be thought of in the same context. And
the Build Back Better bill, or legislation, is probably right down your alley as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
We've been paying very, very close attention, as probably everybody else is, to what happens in the negotiations around the Build Back Better Act. There's a lot of potential new money for housing. There is already a lot of new money for infrastructure in the infrastructure package that passed just previously. So we've been following these really closely, but if I'm being candid, we as a bipartisan organization don't necessarily support the reconciliation process being used in this way. It is an inherently partisan process to only engage Democrats and push something through that could have potentially transformative impacts on our society and economy and our debt and our deficits. So we, in an ideal world, would like to see even the things that we've long supported, like certain provisions within the housing section of the bill, pass through bipartisan support. We have found that means that it's longer lasting. It sustains that bipartisan support if you can push it through like that. But in our divided politics, we understand that this is the path of least resistance, and so that's what they're choosing to do.
I want to use one of the words you just said, sustainable, and go down that road for a minute. Are these policies that are being formed in D.C. sustainable? A part of my responsibility is to not only invest well, but exit well, and make sure that these units remain in compliance or can continually support the workforce. So policies change, like the sustainability of policy.
I think that's why we're so concerned about Build Back Better, is because it undermines the durability, you're right, of those key policy programs, and ones that have traditionally had really broad bipartisan support, like the low-income housing tax credit. One provision within Build Back Better is to expand LIHTC But does that erode, Republican support down the line because Democrats chose to expand it without them? That's a concern that we have. But I think back to your original question is, politics in D.C., policy made in D.C., clearly not the full picture, particularly in housing. I learned very early on in my career there is not a single housing market, right? There are many, 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 many housing markets in the United States. You can walk from one neighborhood to another, and prices, dynamics, everything is different. And so while funding and financing mechanisms in particular can come from, down on high, housing is an inherently local process. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about incentives. Are we incentivizing the right things at the local level? And I think there's still a ton of work to do on that front, clearly.
Tell us about some of your work and maybe a project or an outcome that you're really proud of.
So one thing that we've been working on over the past year, we launched a housing council that has about 23 housing experts, a lot of former HUD officials, elected officials, former mayors, people from across the country. And the project was launched in March to look at housing policies, bipartisan housing policies that can advance racial equity and opportunity. Clearly something that our country has focused on recently and should focus on. But it's been a really interesting kind of journey because we have roughly half, Republicans and Democrats. Clearly there are a lot of differences of opinion on issues around racial equity and opportunity. But I have also found there's so much we can be doing, from down payment assistance to building more housing supply to special purpose credit programs and lending programs to open up access to credit. So it's a really interesting and exciting moment to be talking about that and to get a bipartisan group to engage on it. I think it's really important. And so that's one thing I'm particularly proud of that we continue to work on and should have a report early in 2022.
If you had unlimited resources and you could just push one policy forward on housing, what would it be?
I have found the most frustrating thing about housing for someone who, has worked on it and realizes how important it is to a family and to a community to have affordable housing options within, every neighborhood. The intractability of zoning, land use, NIMBYism, I think it's just so frustrating, and we still don't have great policy tools to overcome that neighborhood opposition to new development. So really thinking through strategies to communicate to people the importance of having options for all different types of families, for all different purposes in every community, and convincing them that it's important and it's in their benefit, to have a couple units next door or an apartment building or just more supply. And so if I had that kind of magic wand, tons of resources, I'd really focus on how we overcome that.
For the listeners and those watching online, our biggest issue is at the local level and this NIMBYism. We have identified over 50 sites, for example, in Phoenix, and 4 of them aren't even going to get off the ground. And many others just have to be slotted later in the pipeline because we can't get past the local opposition. And the local city councils don't really have the ability to stand up against them because they'll be voted out of office. So we're at a lose-lose situation just in that one MSA.
Totally. And BPC actually, the Bipartisan Policy Organization, my work, we did some polling not too long ago. And not surprisingly, people were very favorable of more housing, less so when it's next to them. And so how you overcome, those personal preferences for your community, I think it's just so challenging, but I am very optimistic because we have seen steps taken in places like Minneapolis around single-family zoning, or California statewide getting communities to start to plan exactly how many units they're going to build and where. But I think we're just at the forefront of that kind of movement around communities across the country and taking a hard look at this and seeing what they can do differently.
Do you see in the research that you do the net effect of some of these policies, for example, whether it's at the federal or state level, So many people are leaving the state of California today and coming into my neighborhood. I think 5 people an hour are moving from LA to Clark County. And we know that, I said earlier, because the DMV tracks the driver's license and when they're swiped out or changed. I mean, that's not sustainable, and our infrastructure is really hurt because of it. Now, that's a housing issue and an infrastructure issue. What's going on here?
I think that's actually one of the, when we go talk to Hill offices and we try to communicate the problem of our really acute shortage of affordable homes around the country, how it impedes economic growth overall has really resonated on both sides of the aisle. Republicans care about our growing the economy and recovering and being prosperous. And when we realize that housing is so restricted in some of our most, economically dynamic communities, that it's preventing people from living where there are jobs, that we have a real national problem. It's not just a local housing market problem. And we are starting to see, as you said, prices increase in places that traditionally had been affordable. We work a lot with some officials in Idaho as part of our housing council, and Idaho has had astronomical housing price growth, probably very similar to Utah and Nevada. So I think it's that same flux of people probably mid-pandemic moving to somewhere a little bit smaller, and they're just not being the supply. And I think that is starting to resonate with more people, and it's such an acute problem that it will force action.
Andy, you mentioned supply. Do we have a housing crisis today in America?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have such an acute shortage of supply. I think the last estimate I saw was something like 5 million to 6 million of an undersupply of housing over the last couple of decades. And that has huge impacts on families, on your ability to find, whether it's a rental unit for just you or a couple, all the way up to a larger house for a family. It is preventing people from finding affordable options, from saving money for things like retirement and families, and that has huge impacts across our economy and our society.
There's many things contributing to the housing crisis. Here locally, in DC at the federal level, policies, attitudes. I mean, is it a bipartisan win that is happening, or do we still got a long ways to go?
I think it is really challenging in this dynamic, having Democrat control over Congress and the administration, to engage Republicans in this sort of debate and find solutions. We have seen some promise. Like I said, there are things that do resonate on both sides of the aisle, but it's a difficult time to pass things. So I think we're seeing most of the progress, at state and local levels. But we really need to be doing more to think about those incentives, to think about what we can do at a federal level. And that's really why BPC exists, is to push that cooperation, to push both parties to take housing seriously and keep it bipartisan.
What can you do here in DC, and what can we do locally in working together to move this issue forward?
I think because we're in DC, we have sort of a platform of really engaged and interested people, but we don't always hear local successes, local struggles, and communicate them well to our members of Congress and their staffs. So hearing from local communities is so important about what they're doing well and what they're not doing well, what they need. Particularly when there is a lot of funding available now. There has been a lot of money that's gone out the door in response to COVID-19 and potentially more in Build Back Better. So really thinking through how those different funding streams, those incentives that come from the federal level, support more development, more housing, and really beneficial solutions.
Should we be active in an organization? Should we be publishing research and sending it to you? How do we convey this message and information back to you?
All the above. I think most members of Congress and their staffs are really actually interested to hear from whether you're a business or just a local stakeholder group. There are plenty of opportunities to engage and to make sure they hear your story. Number one, that's important. Reaching out to organizations like ours. We don't always know who to talk to, what's working well, And so finding us and saying, hey, I run a business building housing in Texas. I'd love to talk to you about some of the challenges we're facing. Find those points of engagement and communicate your story. The other thing I would say is that we pay really close attention to best practices, to studies. So if you can in any way, shape, or form take what you're doing, whether it's the challenges you're facing or really successful programs or interventions or what have you, and putting them out, do a study, release it, share it blast it out to DC stakeholders, because it's really, really valuable information for us.
I'd like to work with you on that going
forward.
All
yes,
right.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for coming in today. And this podcast was very informative for me, I'm sure, and all the listeners and those watching. But before we go, I'd like to ask you one question.
Of course.
How would you define attainability?
For housing, and when we think about housing, we need tons of different options for people to meet them where they are in their lives. And I don't think we do a great job yet of having the right units for where you are. So when I think about attainable, I'm thinking about, the older adult who needs home modifications to age in place. I'm thinking about the starter house for someone who wants to start a family. And thinking about housing as a spectrum, having attainable, affordable options across that spectrum in every community. Meeting people where they are and having the supply that helps them in their life, achieve all of the things that they want to achieve the American dream. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Well, you're doing it here at the Bipartisan.
I'm trying.
Oh, this is great. Well, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Join us as we build 40,000 attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily homes by 2030. And if you like the content you're hearing, hit the subscribe button. Follow us at Think MultiGreen and sign up to learn more at www.multi.green.